This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. I'm Randy Moore. I'm the Randy and the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Joined, as always, by the Andy of the Pastor Podcast. Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to be with everyone.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us. Let's jump right in with our soul check-in. For the second week in a row, we are recording on a Wednesday when our typical habit is to record on Tuesday. And so I'm coming out of my Zoom Bible study on the Gospel of Mark. And we, right now, we're in chapter 6, the end of chapter 6, Jesus walking on the water. So Jesus is doing some miraculous things right here in this section of Mark. And, you know, with our scientific minds, post-Enlightenment minds, we're always asking the question, do we have to see these as actual miracles, or is there some natural explanation for it? But the bottom line is, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the presence of Jesus. And whether you see those things as miraculous or you see those things as somehow explained naturally, what made the disciples calm down? Those disciples were so afraid of that storm. What made them calm down was when Jesus rejoined them. Mm. And so that'll preach all day long. Yeah, we don't have to get bogged down.
As they say, the devil is in the details.
Yeah. So that's good for my soul. Soul was fed that way, today. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the way I heard it described once is it's like we read the Bible in a more than literal way. It's not whether or not it actually happened in the way it's written. The question is, what does it have to do with my life today? It's a more than literal way. What's the meaning for my life today?
Yeah, yeah.
That's the way I try to look at it.
Yeah, some people put it this way, and it resonates with me because I work in television news. But you say, imagine, what was it if a television camera was there? What would it capture?
Right.
Now, it might not have captured exactly the way it's described because the description is trying to point to something larger. Mm-hmm. Than what actually, what have happened historically.
Something that's very true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, good. Okay, we're good on that. Let's jump in. We are going through right now some of the parables of Jesus because we're in a stained glass window series here at Methodist Temple. If you've never been to the temple, we've got stained glass windows on the east side, which depict the Beatitudes, and on the west side, they depict some of the parables. We're finished with the Beatitudes, and we're just about to finish up on the parables. And let me just go ahead and read our parable for last week. And what we do each week is we revisit the service and the sermon, and we reflect on it, and we delve a little bit deeper into it. And it's a way of helping that message stick, not only for our listeners, not only for those people who were actually in our service, but I think it helps it stick for us as well, because we can quickly move on to the next thing. So this is Matthew 13:44-53, and it reads like this. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and reburied. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this? They answered, yes. And he said to them, therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. When Jesus had finished these parables, he left that place. The window, and we'll come to this in a little bit, but the window describes, I believe, it describes only the pearl of great price. It's just two verses, 45 and 46.
It's got the pearl And it's got the net.
The net. Okay.
Yeah, so it's got two of them.
Yeah, and so that's why we added those verses right there, because there are the three parables and then the little bit of a lesson after that. Yeah. So you hooked into the Olympics to get your message going?
Yeah. Well, I had to say something about the Olympics at some point. The Olympics are everywhere.
Yeah.
You can't turn on the television and not see something happening, at least in the last few weeks when it comes to Paris. So the thing that occurs to me about the Olympians in general is they have a very clear goal. They're working hard, they're training hard so that they can win gold. And so for a brief time, let's say they win gold, they get to stand on that stage and they've reached their goal. They've got to their destination. And the question I wrestled with in my sermon this week is like, well, what's our goal for our own journey? What's our so that for our own spiritual journey? Where are we going? And that phrase "so that" is a really helpful one. And I'll get into it in a moment, but you find it in the Bible too. But thinking about what our so that is, it moves us from simply doing activities, and it helps us to understand what our outcome really is. And I can talk about the life of the church, but I would also say it happens in our own lives. A lot of the times what happens is we just get busy doing a lot of activities. We don't think about what the outcome is. What are we really trying to do here? And so in the Bible, for example, when we see the phrase "so that," not only do you see an activity being talked about, but you also see an outcome being identified. Here's an example. Exodus 25, I believe it's Exodus 25, verse 8. The Lord says to the Israelites, "Go and make me a sanctuary." And then you get the phrase, "so that I may dwell with the people." So notice something here. You get the activity, but you also get the reason why. And why is it that they build a sanctuary? So that they could be reminded of God's presence in their life. Another "so that" example could be in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Let your light shine to other people through your good works, so that they might give glory to God in heaven." Okay, what's the "so that"? I'm going to go serve my neighbor. Why? Because I want to make God's love real to them, and I want to live my life in such a way that I'm a reminder of God's presence. So having a "so that" is helpful because it keeps us from just walking through the motions of our lives, and it helps us to understand what our outcome is. Now, as we pivot to our parables for this weekend, this past weekend, and the stained glass windows, I find that what Jesus is doing here is he's giving us his "so that" in parable form. The big parable that really we tried to talk about this weekend was the pearl of great price. And the question is, what is that pearl? What does that pearl represent? And it's really a metaphor I think Jesus is using for what's central to him, what's most important to him. Jesus came into the world so that the things on earth would become as they are in heaven. The pearl represents God's will and desire for our lives. And if you were looking at the window right now in the sanctuary, you would kind of see it like a poetic and a stained glass like pictorial depiction of what that is. So you have Jesus with the pearl, which represents the kingdom of God, the will of God for our lives. If you're looking down the window now, in the middle of the window, actually there's a picture of Moses, which I found interesting because Moses is nowhere near the passage that we just read. I mean, you never hear Moses, but he's holding the commandments. And to me, that's symbolic of the pearl represents God's will and desire for our lives. The commandments represent God's will and desire for our lives. And then if you continue to look down the window on the very bottom, you do pick up again our lesson today and you get the net. And so Jesus compares the kingdom of God to like a drag net between two boats where they go through the water and they get whatever fish they get. And at the end of the day, they pull their net to shore and they go through it and they keep the good fish and the bad fish, which that's a challenging metaphor when it comes to the activity of God at the end of time, because that's what the dragnet and all this symbolism is supposed to point to, is the judgment at the end of time. And if you're like me, the question becomes, what's the good fish and what's the bad fish? And you go down this rabbit hole of the afterlife and these kinds of things. But for me now, as I've grown in my faith journey, I try to stay off of the afterlife conversation. Instead, when I hear a parable like that net, I think to myself, what it really is pointing us to also is not every path we take leads to the same destination. And so what Jesus is trying to do when he says, you need to seek after the pearl of great price, what he's saying is, take the path that I've embodied for you. take God's will and desire for your life, because that leads to our flourishing, as opposed to if we don't, it leads to our perishing. And that's kind of what that parable represents. So the so that, though, is God's will and desire for our lives.
It's interesting because Matthew hits this point pretty hard. Just a few verses back from this parable, you get the parable of the wheat and the weeds.
Yeah.
It's a similar message in there, right?
Yeah.
And then in the 25th chapter of Matthew, you get the sheep and the goats.
Well, and yeah, I know in the challenge of those parables, and I'll just be upfront and candid. I'm taking some liberties in the way I'm translating them. Mm-hmm. I'm not even saying this is what Matthew was trying to say. Like, I mean, it's pretty stark. Like, there are good people and there's bad people, and that's it. In Matthew, you're either sheep or you're a goat. You're a good fish or you're a bad fish. Which one are you going to be? And so my modern ears and my little Christian heart struggles with this idea of like, well, we're just going to throw these people into eternal timeout forever? Like, I mean, that's hard. And what's the criteria? That's also difficult. In Matthew's gospel, the criteria is not really, did you get your theology right? Did you get your creed right? That's the tendency in modern Protestant Christianity, is that when we talk about the gospel, we talk about it in terms of some sort of idea that we adhere to. Mm-hmm. But no, that's not what Matthew talks about. When Matthew's dealing with these judgment types of parables, and Jesus is talking about judgment in these parables, the criteria is, did you love your neighbor as yourself? Mm-hmm. Yes or no? And once we get that locked in, then we're challenged in a different direction. Mm-hmm. It's not about our theology and beliefs as much. I'm not going to say that doesn't matter. It does matter. But the real criteria is, what are the fruits? What kind of person did you become? And that becomes the criteria of the judgment at the end of time. So anyway.
So, and then you teased the congregation. You made the congregation think we were bringing back the bulletins.
So that was fun. So we have not had bulletins much since COVID at Methodist Temple. And but as a kind of a visual for my sermon, I created a chart.
You created a bulletin.
It was not as a chart, Randy, but it was so funny. They open it up, and you could just see the look on their face. They're like, finally, there's a bulletin. And they open it up, and it's like, nope, it's a chart about our discipleship. It's a depiction of our so that. And so that was the real question we were trying to talk about in worship on Sunday is, so what is our so that? Jesus is so that is we desire the will of God. What does it look like for us to grow in our own discipleship and our journey with Christ? Because, let's be honest, not everyone thinks of Christian maturity in the same way. Not everybody's picture of what it means to grow up in their faith looks the same. And so in my sermon Sunday, just to kind of get to the point, I used a chart that came from the United Methodist Church website that kind of talked about it. What does it look like to grow up in our worship? What does it look like to grow up in sense of community? What's it look like to grow up in our sense of spiritual practices and our service to others? What's it look like to grow in our journey in terms of our faith? And what is the so that? And the chart to me was very helpful. And what was curious to me is how intently people listened, and they looked, and you could just see them. They were looking in there like, which box am I in? Where am I at on the journey? And so it seemed to be a helpful image and for the people.
Yeah. So you had 5 things that you pointed out with that chart, and one was very familiar. Well, they're all kind of very familiar territory, but the prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace was one way to look at that chart.
Yeah. So again, the chart came from the Methodist Church, and so it's organized around what we call our Wesleyan understanding of grace. Now, I just threw out a lot of religious language right there. I mean, let me interpret that. So Wesleyan, so a John Wesley understanding of how God works in our lives. That's what I'm really talking about when I say a Wesleyan understanding of grace. The word grace is a shorthand term for the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And so when we as Methodists and Wesleyans talk about God's work in our lives, we have 3 terms that we've traditionally used. First is prevenient grace, second is justifying grace, and the third is sanctifying grace. The chart that the folks saw on Sunday was organized around that. Prevenient grace is this idea that God comes looking for us before we go looking for God, and there is a spark of God's divine presence within every single person. And typically what happens when we first start to experience prevenient grace, we begin to long for something more. It could be more in terms of community. It could be more in terms of sense of purpose. It could be more in terms of our sense of God. But what prevenient grace really does in our life, it's really what it is. It is God stirring within us, calling us to that place of more. So that's prevenient grace. Justifying grace is when we finally say, okay, and we become aware of that relationship with God that has existed from the moment that we were created. The moment we entered this earth, we've had a relationship with God. We become aware of a relationship that has always existed. And then we become aware that God loves us just as we are, justifying grace. And I would add, not only does God love us just as we are, God is working in our life in a Christ-like way. And because of that Christ-like love working in our lives work best in Christ-like ways too. And so that's justifying grace. Sanctifying grace is what happens at the end of the day when we begin to say yes to that presence in our life that's working in a Christ-like way. As we begin to give more and more of ourselves to Christ and the Christ-like life within our attitudes and our actions, the idea in the Wesleyan understanding of things is the happier we become. Wesley would say that the holy life is a happy life, which I find very interesting because we all long for happiness, right? So the more and more of our lives we give to Christ, the happier we become. And why? Because that's the way we're created to be. What the chart does is, building on this understanding of grace, it takes these different aspects of the Christian life and then kind of paints us a picture about what it looks like to mature in these different arenas that are a part of the Christian life. So I'll just start at the top of the chart. The first column was worship. And so the chart gives us 5 boxes that talk about the progression of us growing up in our worship. The initial stage of worship is exploring, then there's searching, and then there's beginning, I think is what it talked about, growing and maturing. So what does it look like, though, to grow up in our worship? Well, it starts off with us typically going to a worship service, maybe sporadically. As we grow, those worship experiences become more meaningful. But as we really are starting to get somewhere in the spiritual journey, what we begin to see and realize is, wait a minute, not only is God working in these worship services, God's working in my day-to-day life. And so we know we're becoming more mature in our worship when we start seeing God's activity in our day-to-day life. We're more aware of God on a consistent basis in our lives. I wonder, let me just say it this way. I wonder because I wonder in my own life. I've noticed between Sunday to Sunday, let's be honest, I don't always think about God that much.
Yeah, right.
I forget. I forget about the presence of my life. But what the chart's suggesting is between Sunday to Sunday, we begin to become more and more aware of God's work in our lives. It's not just a thing we do every once in a while. It becomes more of a lifestyle. So community, it talks about what it looks like to grow up in terms of our community. When people first come to church, for example, a lot of the times over the years I would say to people, well, why are you here? What are you looking for? And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, I'm looking for community. Philip Gawley had this great line. He says, people come to church looking for the family they used to have or the family they wish they have. They're drawn to community. And so initially when people show up to a church, sometimes they're looking for that sense of belonging. As we grow up into community, though, what starts as feeling drawn to relationships with others, if we continue to cultivate that within our lives, we begin to feel at home in that community. But then the pivot comes when we begin to shift from what we get from that community to what we can give to that community. And we know we've grown up in a sense of community when we're there for other people in the midst of their difficult times. And then to push the envelope further, the chart says in the maturing stage, we are actively seeking out people different than us, and we seek to enter into relationship with them. And that's the practice of really Christian community. We're on the positive offensive when it comes to developing relationships within our lives. I'll be honest with you, I feel convicted on this one because the tendency we all have is to just surround ourselves in that echo chamber, right? With people that think like us, look like us, tell us what we want to hear.
Right.
And if I'm really honest with my own experience, though, oftentimes it's when I'm in relationship with people who are different than me, especially when it comes to religion and faith, like people from other faith perspectives and stuff, when I'm in relationship with them, boy, they help me understand my own faith in new ways that I would have never, ever seen before. So the idea here is God calls us outside of our box. We're called to be there for people in difficulty, sure, absolutely. But we're also called to stretch the boundaries of our circle and stretch the boundaries of our community.
You also related this to being a pastor, and you said that people don't remember what we say, but that we were there. And that, as a pastor, that resonates with me. And you're exactly right. I try to find all the right words when I visit, but the words don't matter. Someone said to me one time, it stopped me in my tracks. They said, you can't fake being there. You can fake a lot of things, but you can't fake showing up.
Right. They'll remember you were there.
Yeah.
They're not going to say, well, what did he say? No, he was there. He was present with me. He stepped into the difficulty with me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the secret to pastoral ministry is showing up and paying attention. That's about it in a nutshell. And once you get that, anyone can do that. I joked in my sermon. I said, pastors are there when we hatch, when we're matched, and then when we're dispatched from this earth.
I thought you said hitched.
Hitched. I saw that in the no. It's matched. Hitched.
Yeah, I like hitched better.
You like hitched better? And then and every once in a while we're invited to the birthday parties. I added that.
Okay.
But if you think about what's happening there, we are showing up in a person's life at those emotional high points, but also those emotional low points that every person experiences. And what the pastor does is step into those. And that's why a lot of times we are remembered. It's not our sermons that people remember typically, not the classes we teach typically. It's that we showed up. And when we think about what it means to be in community, to actually practice community, at the heart of it is, I'm going to show up. I'm going to show up for people. And I'm especially going to show up for people when they are having a tough time.
And we model that for the congregation.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's a priesthood of all believers.
Yeah.
In the Protestant way of thinking of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so worship, community, spiritual practices.
Yeah. That's something you and I are very passionate about. I'll be honest. I wish I could find a way to light a fire when it comes to spiritual practices.
Right.
Because they probably, more than anything else, can have the biggest impact when a person is intentionally trying to become aware of God's presence in their life beyond just those moments where they're a part of the church, but they're doing it on a day-to-day basis. That's when you're going to get somewhere when it comes to the journey. And so what does it look like to grow up in terms of spiritual practice? Well, like anything in our lives, it starts out with some experimentation, right? Like you're going to try out some things. The chart kind of lays that out. You start becoming curious about God, and then you start trying out spiritual practices, and then you start to find ones that work, and you begin to experience God in your life, and that starts to change you. And what the chart suggests is we know we are growing in our spiritual practices is not only are we starting to become changed, but we're willing to recommend spiritual practices to other people, which I'm going to venture to say that's going to make a good many Christians a little nervous to talk about, this is my ritual, this is my personal spiritual practice. And And I think more and more, Randy, as we think about the church changing and the role of the pastor starting to change in some ways, I feel like one of our major roles is going to be to help people understand what different spiritual practices are, and then understand how those practices can change their lives, and then equip people to be able to talk about those practices with other people so that we can share that opening, if you will, into God's presence in our lives. More and more, I think that's going to need to be one of our bigger emphases.
And you're going to share some of those spiritual practices in what we call open community.
Right. Yeah. Every fall we have some fall programming. We call it open community. And I'm going to offer what I'm calling spiritual labs. And so they're like standalone courses where I'm going to offer different things, that activities a person can engage in so that they can open their lives to God's presence in their life. And the three different spiritual labs I'm going to offer are Christian meditation and spiritual journaling. I'm going to offer one on the power of small groups, which is the method of Methodism. And the third one I'm going to talk about is reading the scripture for transformation. Not so that I have a whole mind full of Bible quotes, but actual transformation in my life. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I'm taking those from my own life because those are the kind of practices that have worked well for me. Mm-hmm. Spiritual reading, being in community, intentional accountability type of community. And then I'm at my best when I'm doing what I call centering prayer.
Yeah, spiritual reading, it makes me think of Lectio Divina. And it's not that what I'm going to say right now is Lectio Divina, but what we do in my Zoom Bible study, and we're studying the Gospel of Mark right now, we read the text that we're studying, that we're opening ourselves to. We read it 3 times. And so someone, we have enough people that we have enough translations of the Bible that we read it in 3 different translations.
Nice.
So that you get the repetition, and because we don't know Hebrew and Greek, we get 3 different translations.
Right. Yeah.
So that helps us understand better than we would otherwise. And we let the text, to the degree that it can, speak on its own. Now, it needs help. We've talked about this before. It needs help because the text is ancient, and it's in another culture, and it's in another language. And it's even in languages that, like Jesus spoke Aramaic, he didn't speak Greek. So it's already there. It's already, John. Right. So those things are important still, even though they're translated into English, to try to let the text be the text and let the Spirit be involved in that before you start breaking it all down and studying it.
Dissecting it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You talked about Lectio.
Yeah.
The ancient practice of kind of meditatively reading the text. One of the things that it is meant to do is to challenge the reader, in this case, readers, to approach the text with curiosity. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that goes away a lot of the times as we are acclimated to a certain religious tradition, especially the text of a certain religious tradition. Mm-hmm. We look at a text and we think, we already know what it's saying. And so really what we're doing is we're hearing what we want to hear, and not necessarily what God's wanting to speak to us through that text. It's almost in the sense like we're reading the text not so that we can read the text, but we want the text to begin to read us and challenge us in our own journey, in our own walk. Mm-hmm. That's where the spiritual transformation or reading the Bible for transformation can actually take place. It's really hard to get people to engage in that because in our own enlightenment type of mindset, you talked about the enlightenment earlier in the podcast, we try to just impose this kind of scientific worldview on spiritual texts. Mm-hmm. And it's not meant to be digested in that way necessarily.
Right.
It's good to have historical context, don't get me wrong, but there's some things that a text is just not saying, but opening ourselves to the Spirit speaking through those words in a new way, afresh to us, is where the passages jump off the page when you're able to enter into that curiosity type of mindset.
So there's an opening for you, listener. If you're not involved already in open community, or maybe you're not even involved or aware of Methodist Temple at all, keep your mind open toward that. That may be a door opening for you, an opening for you to become involved and to pick up some spiritual practices and to meet some people and form some relationships. Okay, so we've got worship and community, spiritual practices, and finally service.
Mm-hmm. A life of service. The chart does a great job with it. And if you're a listener, I think we could probably figure out a way to put the chart in the notes for the podcast. We need to work on that because we've been talking about this chart, and I know some people who worshiped with us online were like, I want to see that chart that you were talking about. And so we're going to work on trying to get that in the notes of our podcast this week.
Okay.
But service, the chart does a great job talking about service. Typically, it begins with the search for meaning. And that's something that's massively pervasive in our culture today. I think one of the big challenges of our culture today is we're just searching for meaning and purpose in our lives. There's a crisis of meaning right now in our lives. Like a lot of people are growing up post-Christian, so they've not been exposed to some of the religious traditions that for a very long time has held communities together. And one of the things that I think has gone away as we walked away from religion is this bigger conversation of meaning and purpose. Why am I here? What am I for? And so if you grow up with a strictly secular mindset, I mean, the worst case scenario is I've come from nothing. I'm going to nothing.
Right.
The best I can hope for is it works out the way I wished in this life. And that's what happiness is. What the faith teaches us is no. Like happiness is about realizing I'm here for a purpose and I'm not an accident. The creator of the universe has gone to all the trouble to make me me. And so what service really starts out as is I'm just searching for meaning. And then the first stages of service become like, I go experiment on a service project now, maybe a one-time type of thing. That feels pretty good. I like this. Mm-hmm. After you do some experimentation, a lot like the spiritual practices type of stuff, you begin to learn what your gifts are, though, in this case. This is what I'm actually good at. This, to say it another way, this is what gives me energy, right? This is what I'm passionate about. I think one of the ways to figure out what we're really gifted in is I'll do this even if I'm not getting paid for it. Right. You couldn't stop me from doing this. I mean, and I'll use my own self as an example. I've often thought, would I still be a pastor if they stopped paying me tomorrow? And I laughed and I said, within like 2 or 3 weeks, I'll probably have a little Bible study going with a little community. I just could not do it because I love to have the conversations. That's my passion. But we all have passions. It doesn't have to be like pastoral ministry. It could be like you're an artist or there's a particular group of people you care about, or everyone's different because, God's a diverse God and we're a diverse people and we're called to love in a diverse way. So as we grow in our service, we begin to become aware of our gifts. As we become aware of our gifts, we begin to hone those gifts. But when we really mature, we start to realize, wait a minute, this is no accident. I am designed to love. And so it goes from just trying to do something that you're passionate about to a whole different lifestyle shift. And the chart talks about we restructure our whole life to reflect God's kingdom. What's that mean? We've come to realize that we are here for a reason, and the reason is to reflect the love of God. And we begin to go beyond just those things that we do and don't do in terms of our service to how do I orient my actions and attitudes to consistently reflect the love of God in my life, because that's why I'm here. So,
and you ask the people to pray about that. What's my mission?
Yeah, that's a great prayer, right? Like, you sometimes ask a person, "Well, what's your mission?" Well, I'm here for all people. That's an excuse. No. What's your mission? Like, what's God called you to do? What are you passionate about? What do you love? That's what we're asking. And we all have different things different ways to answer that question. What's my so that in terms of service? Yeah.
Or my so what? Or am I hitched?
You just couldn't stop. Couldn't help yourself, Randy. So, yeah, that's fun.
And so the challenge, your sermons always come with a challenge, which we're on the back of the on the back of the folder.
Yeah, there was so I created, on the inside of the program, there was the chart, but on the outside of the program, I had come up with some questions that a person could just ask themselves and reflect on. So the question in terms of worship was, how is it with my soul? And another way to ask that question would be how is my life with God? If it helps, you can do it like on a scale of 1 to 10. 0 would be I rarely think of God, of course. A 10 would be like I'm aware of God on a consistent basis. So how's my life with God? That's worship. The next one was community. How have I felt the nudge of God's presence this is service. Sorry.
Okay.
The next one was service. How have I felt the nudge of God's presence to love my neighbor in some specific way, either through word or deed. It's through our sharing of kindness, let's be honest, that we have the biggest impact. And so the third category was spiritual practices. How have I intentionally opened my life to God? And then the fourth one was community. How can I be praying for and supporting others, but also how can I invite others to pray for and support me? Those were the questions. And when I found with those types of questions, I actually ask myself those questions in a covenant group with another pastor friend of mine every week. What I found is if a person is truly going to take those questions seriously, they need to do that in community with other people. I mean, yeah, you can do it on an individual basis, yeah. I mean, one way to do it is to journal, and that's a way. And I would encourage the listeners to try the journaling part. Journal your life with God. Journal the events of your day-to-day life, sure. But if you want to get somewhere, I'm telling you, you've got to share it with someone else. Jesus, one of the first things Jesus does after he gets out of the wilderness, what's he do? He goes and calls some disciples to go with him because he doesn't do it alone. Mm-hmm. His disciples become his legacy, really. If you stop and think about it, what's Jesus' legacy? That ragtag group of 12 people that go out and change the world. That's his legacy. He didn't do it alone. And so if we really want to develop, though, in our own relationship with God, it means we have to develop a relationship with others, and we hold each other accountable to these sorts of spiritual questions.
Okay, so look for this this chart. Look for this chart in some form so that you can understand more deeply what we're talking about. Okay, great. Let's talk about this coming Sunday. This just hit me as I glanced down at my notes. You always hear that John didn't have any parables.
Here it is.
Is this the one?
This is this is one. I mean, okay. For sure, it's a parable. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. John 10, 1-5. That's going to be the basis of this Sunday's sermon. Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Very truly, I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. And so just a brief preview of this Sunday in the message.
Simple. How do we hear the voice of God in our lives? That's it. That's what I'm talking about. Like different ways that we can hear God's voice in our lives. And I'll just say, it's not like an audible voice. I don't think most people hear an audible voice, but I do believe each and every one of us can hear the voice of God in our lives, that the divine presence guiding us. And I'm going to give some very specific ways. How do we listen to that voice, the voice of the shepherd?
Very good. All right. That should do it for this week. It's been good to be with you here, Pastor Andy, and listeners. It's been so good to have you with us, and we hope you have a wonderful week. If you'd like to participate in the life of our church, you are more than welcome. You can do that in person. You can do it virtually, and you can continue to do it by listening to the podcast. We're just so appreciative of the fact that you're there, and we'll see you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.